morning, everyone. Magandang umaga. I am Steven Acabado. For those who don't know me, I am an associate professor of anthropology and the director of the UCLA Center for Southeast Asian Studies. Welcome to one of the first in-person events of the center and my very first in-person event as the director of the center. I've been the director for almost a year. But before I introduce our panel and our forum today, I would like to recognize that as a land grant institution, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies at UCLA acknowledges the Gabrielano Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tobangar, the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. I would also like to thank the Department of Anthropology, my home department, for the use of this room, and for Andrew and Paul for helping us with the recordings, and Maddie and Christine for helping set up this event. The Philippine general election is just a few days away and it's giving me a massive anxiety attacks, having the difficulty sleeping at night, and with the specter of another Marcos presidency. After 6 years of a Duterte administration characterized by many as murderous and inefficient. So our panel today will discuss how the Duterte strongman rule and the Philippine elections scheduled May 9th could put the more than 3 decades project of re-democratization to a halt. We are joined by Dr. Patricio Abinales, Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Hawaii-Manoa, Dr. Lisandro, Claudio, Assistant Professor of South and Southeast Asian Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. This conversation will serve as a primer for the upcoming national elections in the Philippines while taking account broad questions about the health of Philippine democracy. Our panelists will also take into account how national shifts are informed by local ones, particularly in vote-rich areas of Mindanao. The conversation will be moderated by Dr. Ceci Cruz, Assistant Professor of Political Science at UCLA, who joined us last year, and this is just our first time to meet in person as well. So, welcome.
Thank you so much. So I believe our panelists have prepared some opening remarks.
Younger people.
There
Start. Okay, so Bobo is a friend from the University of the Philippines, so invited to come here. It's actually appropriate because I was a freshman when Marcos declared martial law. So for the first 2 months at the University of the Philippines, there was all these rallies. And then sometime September 21, there was a ROTC. Filipinos were still, males were required to take ROTC training then. So we went to the University of the Philippines, and instead of the ROTC officers facing us, there was a Marine armed personnel carrier with a machine gun telling us to go home. And that's when we realized something had changed. The TV had disappeared. There was no, by afternoon, there was only Francisco Tata, the Minister of Information, Marcos's Goebbels, who was on TV, and then Marcos appeared on 6 o'clock. So the first reaction then was to hide all our materials, all the propaganda, the left-wing materials we had, bury them on, and then cut our hair. Because one of the things that the Marcoses did in Manila was to start stopping people on the streets, people with long hair. And the university was closed for two months, and then reopened. UP was reopened in December, and the first people we encountered coming into the buildings were a bunch of uniformed policemen and reminiscence to World War II, a guy with a paper bag pointing at people who were coming in. The police just snatching them. And then in our classrooms. There were, not student-looking classmates of ours suddenly appearing, crew cut it, and monitoring everything. It was so scary because even the born-again Christian books in the library with the name Revolution had to be hidden. So like, even the librarian. So for the first, the entire semester of martial law, there were marches also. I learned how to put gunpowder between sandwiches and use the aluminum foil to go to the fourth floor of our building and throw it down the police. But that didn't work, and eventually people have been arrested. And the news came with two things. One is that a lot of our classmates were suddenly disappeared, and some of them were returned as dead bodies. One of my classmates in history department came back. He apparently joined the NPA, but there was also news of war in the south. And I come from Osami City in the northern island of Mindanao. We've never seen the Philippine state. Our first encounter of the Philippine state was the Philippine Navy with tanks and soldiers coming in to go in across the bay in Lanao del Sur, where the Moro National Liberation Front was fighting. And that was our first we're growing kids, and we was 18, and that was when I first encountered body bags and refugees. And so something was happening, and so by 1973 you started to live with martial law and find a way to make fun of it. So that was, and then I was 30. Was 30 when Marcos was out of power. So we were all there in EDSA eating Kentucky Fried Chicken, by the way. Because Kentucky Fried Chicken opened a franchise then. And we were the perfect market, 1 million people sitting there and can out cost and just bowling out because you suddenly your entire young adulthood was framed by this guy, and he left, and so now that his son is coming back, it's really scary because it brings back memories of what happened to us in 1972. I can tell more stories later, but that's why when Boboy said, "I'm going to talk about the elections," I said, "Sure." Scary. Okay. Leave it.
Thank you for that
Thank you.
context. Professor Claudio.
Yeah, I don't have much of an opening statement except to say, and people can ask different questions, but my kind of working thesis now is that the Philippines is becoming similar to Thailand in the sense that the political system has become decoupled with the economic system. So during the time of the first Marcos administration, if we're going to start calling that the first Marcos administration, knock on wood, the regime was beset by economic crises, and there were changes in the regime that were a result of these economic crises. So for example, in 1970, when he appointed a new set of technocrats who kind of cleaned up fiscal and monetary policy, that was a result of kind of inflationary crisis at the turn of the century. And it was also a result of a kind of political crisis that people called the First Quarter Storm. Even in 1981, for example, when he formally lifts martial law, right? That was because of the beginnings of the crisis of the 1980s after the Volcker rate hike here in the United States. So kind of like global economic events were influencing the kind of political crisis in the Philippines. But what you saw with Duterte is, by and large, the Philippine economy is performing the way it's been expected to perform. So these economic crises do not affect the kind of popularity of the strongman in the Philippines. And in that sense, it's becoming similar to Thailand. One of the reasons why there's a kind of continuity in Thai politics despite all of the coups is because regardless of who you have in power, the economic system is staying the same. So, for example, if you talk to central bank governor, the current central bank governor, he thinks that after kind of the post-COVID decline wherein growth was not at par, he thinks next year is going to return to 5-6%. Of course, we don't know. He's probably going to raise interest rates, so that might slow down because he's responding to the Fed, right? But long-term picture is that this country is not going to be beset by economic crisis in the near future. So how to resolve the kind of political contradiction of this new Marcos era is going to be an interesting question.
That's a great point. And so I think one thing we can think about moving forward is whether that decoupling of politics and economic conditions and what that means for the Philippines moving forward. So I'm happy to take questions from the audience as well, but I was hoping to get us started with one first question about the conduct of the campaign. One thing, of course, here, even in this panel, we're on Zoom. We're thinking about new ways of reaching audiences, new ways of communicating opinions and information about politics. What can we learn from this particular election campaign? Are there lessons that we can learn about these new forms of political communication? You know, there's sort of negative and positive, right? There's the troll farms, there's grassroots organizations. How do you see that as changing or affecting the broader context of Philippine politics?
So the Marcos disinformation campaign has been a kind of slow burn campaign. A lot of people think that it just started in 2016 when he ran for vice president. But the first time I saw material that I thought was coming from the Marcoses was in 2010, or very early years of the Aquino presidency. Of course, these were not branded as Marcos, but the narrative was already very similar to the Marcosian narrative that we have that we had now. So this has been a long-term effort. And in here we're just talking about social media, but the journalist and professor Sheila Coronel said that if you actually look at the broader picture of misinformation and disinformation, it started in 1965. Because in 1965, that was when Marcos started to claim that he was a war hero. In fact, if you read the book, for example, For Every Tear of Victory, which is the authorized biography of Marcos, the claims there were bizarre. There is one claim there where he claims that he saved Australia from the Japanese because he delayed the Japanese attack in the Philippines and therefore single-handedly saved Australia. That's how absurd it's been since the 1960s. So this is just a natural conclusion of the kind of disinformation that has always been at the center of the Marcos narrative.
I also remember the comic books and things
Oh,
with
yeah.
Marcos as the hero, because I was a kid during that time and thinking like we would get these comic books featuring superhero Marcos.
But the I don't know much about social media. I'm old, so the one thing that was really interesting is um, in 1986, President Corazon Aquino introduced democratization. And one of the inadvertent impact of that was to demonopolize the control of the production of textbooks in the Philippines, which Marcos had. The result of that is by decentralizing it, they privatized it too. So that what happens now is that institutions of higher education can choose which textbooks to get. And this is where the Marcoses saw the importance of teaching kids this revisionist history, 1986, 87, 87. And so one thing, so you can pay, if you're running a textbook, you actually are, your textbook is accepted by, say, the Private School Association of the Philippines, you earn 1 million a month pesos. It's 12 million. The publisher gets what, 12 million a month, I think? So it becomes a game of how much can you pay the people in the Department of Education to approve your textbook.
That's why your textbook doesn't do too well.
No, we do good. Yeah, that's why we don't.
We have experience.
We're too nice.
We wrote the textbook, but like for example, like we got plagiarized by another textbook,
Oh, yeah,
like direct plagiarism. And then the system doesn't care because it's completely anarchic, right?
Yeah, it's
Can't do
anarchic
anything
because
about it.
unfortunately the product of President Aquino's effort to democratize the system. So what happened then was that publishers, paying off Department of Education officials, started to introduce textbooks not only at the higher level but in elementary school. So there's actually textbooks for kindergarten, Filipinos in kindergarten schools, where they have to learn how to write cursive, and one of the things they have to write is President Marcos is the greatest president we ever had. So think about this. This is 1986, 87. And that was the first thing that that impacted it. The second problem really is nobody has sat back and sat down and said, let's tell the story of martial law. Okay, there is no textbook, there is no historical textbook on martial law itself. I don't know why.
Follow-up question to our lovely history professor about what it means for the discipline of history and the way that martial law is taught in our country.
Yeah, so the way it's been taught is that it's been taught in a kind of objective way. And I mean this is the problem because we've been writing textbooks recently. And when you're dealing with the editors, they're always asking you, are you writing in an objective way? And objective for them usually just means lists where you don't kind of make any comments about what happened, right? It's also because the kind of school teacher just wants a kind of automatic slide that he or she can provide for the students. So they like lists. So how do you end up writing history if that's the way you're structuring your textbooks and effectively your lectures? It's like Carlos Garcia, he promoted the Filipino First policy. That's a list. And then Ramon Magsaysay, he kind of opened the doors of Malacanang. And then other achievements or other things he did. And then when you get to Marcos, it's just a list. Like he spent a lot of money in the 1960s. He built a lot of classrooms. He declared martial law, and he was around for decades. That's it. There's no context because it's supposed to be objective, right? And this idea that we need to be objective in that particular way is, I think, really what's damaged the history writing in the Philippines.
And the other thing is that the senior historians of that generation were both by Marcos. Marcos had this TADA Project where he was supposed to rewrite the entire history of the country since 12th century. So it was a 5-volume project. 3 of my professors at UP were part of it. In 1975, they were trying to recruit us, supposedly to work in the archives. But it was a great grand project of Marcos. And so these top historians were already compromised. And up to even today, some of them said they did something right because it was in defense of the nation. So if these historians were also, were all became mercenaries, okay, who else would take over and write the history of the regime? The second generation of historians, half of us went to the mountains and killed and stopped studying. And so there was a big gap of, I think in my generation of historians, half of them were killed. So there is no next generation. And of course, by the 1980s, universities were saying, well, you cannot just be a BA historian major, or you cannot just be a outside historian. You have to get your PhDs. And by that time, PhD was 7 years. So that was, I think, what happened. So there was no one to take over and say, like Agoncillo, for example, Fedor Agoncillo, with the history of Filipino people. But Agoncillo was already compromised. He used to talk about martial law. Renato Constantino, the other one who's, his book is used as a textbook in the Philippines, but Constantino will not talk about the dictatorship because that was one of the conditions for his release. So he can only write about nationalism, imperialism, but nothing about Marcos. He only wrote about it in the 86. So these historians who could have easily taken that, their students were compromised by Marcos. They could not write because Marcos said, you can only write from today. And then Marcos has this grand dream of writing his textbook, the TADA Project. Everybody stole from it. So that's one reason historically that there was nothing about martial law.
Wow, that's fascinating. I knew about the history for the journalists, right? Like I knew that some journalists were getting persecuted, but I didn't realize that the same thing was happening to the historians as well, and leading to these types of outcomes.
They were paid well.
Wow.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, of course.
So I just wanted to find out what your thoughts were, because after the Marcos dictatorship was toppled, there was Cory Aquino, and then after her it was Ramos, right? So there were at least 2 terms, and 6 years each term. That's 12 years.
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't someone start writing? Why do you think none of the writers or even the journalists that spoke heavily against the history that was being purported? I mean, it's very frustrating for me because I learned Philippine history in the Philippines, and to find out now at over 50, to find out that all of the things that I learned, like 90% of it was not true.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, why do you think no one's trying to make that clear and make that correct?
But
Because especially for the kids, I'm concerned for the kids because at the rate things are going right now, I'm not even sure that we have real democracy in the Philippines. as much as people say. And I don't think that I'm going to be alive to see actual democracy in the Philippines. But if people are not going to start making things known, then you're going to still have these masses of people that are still going to vote the Marcoses in. And as you can see in the polls right now.
But from my generation, the problem is trauma. Okay, you live 15 years of a dictatorship. You know, have you ever been shot? Have you ever been arrested? Have you been, you know? And it's not easy to say, okay, Marcos is done. Let's go back and write, because you have to deal with the trauma. One of my projects I was doing in the early last decade was interviewing all these activists from the pre-martial law era, because they're now in their 70s, no? And the only way we could get them to talk is to say, tell us your story, because this is for your grandkids. They will never tell it outside. So it's only now, for example, memoirs from the generation of first martial law activists, pre-martial law activists, they're only coming out now. So that, I mean, and the one thing that was common in all of them, how traumatized they were, and also how proud they were that at 16 years old they were going to mountains, and then something happened, the left collapsed, and so they had to deal with it. I mean, one of the person I interviewed, she said, the first thing I did coming from the mountain is to learn how to dance, because I had no life. I was going to the mountain, and you know, it was supposed to be bourgeois, you know, reactionary to go dancing. So that's what I did. I did ballroom dancing. I was like, what? But that sort of thing really takes time. I can't write my story yet. The second thing is that there's a big segment of martial law history that remains written, and this is my bias as from somebody from Mindanao. In 1975, half of Mindanao was a war zone. Okay. Young Muslims, young Filipinos were sent as army officers, and that fought for 3 years. My cousin was in the army, said they were fighting an enemy which was supplied by Libya from cans of toilet paper. And the interesting thing is that nobody knows in Manila about it. And these guys are just starting to talk now. Okay. And they're in their 80s. I had a fascinating interview with a peasant who became an imam because he had to set up a mosque because it was non-taxable. And I said, so what's your experience in the He said, oh, I was in Libya. Like, what? Yeah, I was sent there to Libya and trained by East German, anti-tank troopers to learn how to do attack tanks along with members of the Irish Liberation Army, IRA, the Sri Lankan, the Tamil Tigers, and Southern Thais. And he was in his 70s, and nobody has ever sat down with him and said, okay, tell me your stories. The third thing is, remember, this is martial law. You don't keep papers. Okay? One of my problems now is I don't remember names. Not because I'm old, I'm old. But the thing when you're a student at UP in 70, 74, you forget names because once they arrest and torture you, you won't tell them. So until now, it's really like a habit of me. I can't remember names. And so that is also part of the trauma that we're recovering. And alas, they're just starting to write it now. And there's all these fascinating stories. But you cannot just you cannot just interview people in Manila. The war was outside of Manila. The repression was outside of Manila. Even soldiers actually were traumatized by it. Young Ilocanos sent suddenly to Mindanao and had to talk in Filipino to a Maguindanao who doesn't speak Filipino. And they never understood. They're like the Russians now at Ukraine. And now they're coming back and said, yeah, I was there. I don't know what happened. And so that story is not there. And the fourth thing is really the state. In 2005, a bunch of military colonels approached my friend at the University of and said, Ma'am, we have 3 large rooms like this of files from the martial law era. And we don't know, we have to dispose of it because all these former communists are congressmen now. What do we do with it? And I tell you, 3 floors of this, including the Aquino assassination, was at the intelligence service of the intelligence service of the Armed Forces Philippines office. But damn it, they tried to overthrow Gloria Arroyo, and we couldn't access to that anymore. And it was really rotting because the armed forces had no money. actually crumbling from the 1950s. Chinese immigration to somebody even said, "Hey, we have your picture." You were like, "What?" And I had 3 files, but nobody has access to that because the state refuses to share that, even after Aquino came to power. It was just too compromising. So where do you get the archive? Where do you get the library? It's really a tedious task to write at this point. And yeah.
I want to say though that the basic contours of why the Marcos regime was evil, it's there.
Yeah, there.
So even if a lot of these archives have not opened up, a lot of these memoirs have not written, there was no excuse to not popularize the evils of the Marcos regime. And I think the people that we need to blame for that are largely educators who decided to just teach the kind of elite middle class this history, because they think of this elite middle class as the kind of vanguard of society and the vanguard of democracy. And there's this feeling that if the right people know the right history, that we're going to be okay, right? So if you, for example, they went to the University of the Philippines, I went to Ateneo de Manila University, largely considered, one and two, or 2 and 1, depending on who you ask, right?
Our backyard.
Let's call it our backyard. So last night there was a basketball game between the two universities, and the entire crowd was wearing pink, which is the color of the opposition. Which means the kind of educated middle class, this vanguard, has been successfully educated in the horrors of the Marcos regime. But the kind of arrogance of this class is to think that once we've educated each other, we don't leave those circles. And that's, I think, one of the bigger reasons why this history is not circulating.
That's a great point. And I think another point of hope for the future when looking at history and the type of analysis is Professor Claudio's book project that he's working on right now, where I think a lot of these types of thinking about filling the gaps about where we don't have the scholarship and where we don't have those things. So that's my little bit of hope for Philippine history moving forward. So the other thing I wanted to extend, thinking about this idea of political communications and this gap between the what it means for the elite middle class versus the rest of the country. Where do you see the points of optimism? Like, are there signs where you think voters are able to learn or take in new information, or is it just so much that's happening in the information landscape that there's not those sort of entry points to be able to reach voters?
So Jojo and I have been taking a lot of flack because we're defending the polls. We believe that the polls are accurate. There is no reason for us to think that the polls this time around will be inaccurate, because this poll, Pulse Asia, has gotten it right. It got right the Arroyo election, which was very close. Got right the Aquino election. Got right the Duterte election. So if you're working, there is such a thing as polling error. But if you just employ Occam's razor, the simplest conclusion to make is that Ferdinand Marcos will win the presidency and could become the first majority president in the Philippines. We vote in terms of plurality since his father. So that is a scary prospect. So we get accused. So when you say that, you get accused of dismissing the opposition. You're saying that the opposition did nothing, but actually, the opposition has done something. In particular, those people, win or lose, the opposition has made its mark. And I think they're going to lose, but they've definitely made their mark. So around 20-25% support the candidacy of the Vice President, Lenny Robredo. And that seems small compared to Marcos's whatever 50%, right? But 20 to 25% of 67 million registered voters is still huge. That's the millions of Filipinos. And it is a group of energized Filipinos who have taken this history seriously and seem to have committed to a kind of long-term pro-democratic struggle. And this is already your base for the new democratic movement in the Philippines. And it's possible that this base is going to be joined by, possibly elements that are less democratic but have always been anti-Marcos, for example, Muslim separatists, communist rebels, right? But that could be the future of the opposition.
It has an army. the more Islamic Liberation Front is supporting this is Rubin, Vice President Rubin.
Did those polls take into consideration the additional groups that have come forward in support of Len Robredo?
I know you're the moderator, but I think you're the best.
Oh, the right to the question. So I think so with Pulse Asia, I think they do use very modern sampling and survey techniques. But I think a lot of the problems that we've had, even the fact that we're even debating
Right.
polling, I think in the Philippines, is because there is a history of us not doing a very good job of getting the sampling right. And the way I like to think about it is that polls are only as good as your sample. So you can ask a million things, but if we're just asking it in this room, we don't learn anything about what the rest of the country is saying. So the best way to sort of interpret or disentangle is to look at how they did that sampling strategy. I think that's sort of the best indicator of how predictive it's going to be. And in a country like the Philippines, it's actually very challenging to do because there's not even in some places there's not list of voters, there's not list of registered, there's not even the barangay lists sometimes are not complete. And the problem is the places where there is that most mismatch between available data and availability to reach people via polling are also the ones that are sort of most interesting for us that we don't know about in terms of polling. So my guess would be that most of them would have error rates that would tend to be higher than what we would be used to seeing in the U.S. or countries where it's a little bit easier to do it logistically. But in terms of methodology, I would agree with everybody here that Pulse Asia is one of the best in terms of being able to get a broad swath of not just in terms of being able to be representative of the population, but also to understand the limits of what it is that they're doing. So I think that's the big problem is that sometimes we don't have that modesty to say that we don't know this part or we don't know. Whereas I think with Pulse Asia, what sets them apart is they know what their sample is and they have a good sense of what exactly they're missing and not.
Yeah.
That's fair.
Yeah, I wasn't going to ask about methodology because there are several methodologies that go into polling, and it just depends really on who you ask. Yeah, my question was more the last poll that they did was that before just between the last week, right? There were a lot of groups that gave their support to the vice president as opposed. They've been moving from Marcos Jr. over to Robredo's side. So I was just wondering if those polls, because those numbers that you're talking about, I've seen them before these groups.
Yeah.
I was just not sure if there was another one that came recently.
The last one was the last one? April. It would have been mid-April, I think, when they did their field work.
Yeah.
And there does tend to be some lag, but the other thing too is that I think they are very much predictive. Like Professor Claudio was saying, Pulse Asia has done a fairly good job of predicting how these contests are done.
Yeah.
But the flip side of it is that from survey data that we've conducted, there are still many Filipinos that make the decision to vote, they're still undecided, even like days into coming into the election.
Or they verbally say
right,
that
or
they're going to vote for someone, but actually vote for
exactly.
someone else.
Or that they don't have a policy preference in the way that they vote. So the vote is entirely who handed them money or something along those lines. So I think that's another limitation of the polling is that we are able to measure the vote intent, but we don't necessarily measure the vote buying and the other things that would contribute to the voting decision.
Okay, I'll shut up now.
Oh no,
It's
me
five
too.
thou- it's 5,000
You can tell I
pesos
like surveys, so
No,
like,
yeah.
nobody should ask me about surveys.
It's 5,000 pesos now. In 2019, it's 2,000 pesos per vote. So it's gone up. And people actually have become more cynical and say, well, wait. That's one thing. The other thing really is also, it depends on the elections. How did Mrs. Arroyo win in 2004? She won by 1 million votes over the aging movie star Fernando Poe. Where did the 1 million votes come from? The autonomous region of the Mindanao, run by the warlord and Paduan family, who massacred everybody, people in 2007, 8, 1 million people, 1 million votes came from the poorest region of the country. Took some time for Mrs. Arroyo to win. With the story from the bottom. 3 teachers filled it up. 3 public school teachers filled up the ballots in exchange for nice houses. So how do you, I mean, they are as polls, and and really, it's a great way of determining Filipinos. But there's also these intervening factors like, hey, I have my army here. I rule this region like a dispo. I'll bring you the 1 million votes.
Yeah.
And Mindanao has played that role always in winning, in determining national outcomes.
Yeah, and that's why Ferdinand Marcos Jr. wins. I think the thing that needs to be said is that the Dutertes gave him the palace for a number of reasons. First reason is because Rodrigo Duterte buried Ferdinand Marcos Sr. in the Hero Cemetery and helped in the rehabilitation of the Marcos name.
Yeah.
And more broadly, of course, helped in the rehabilitation of this idea of discipline and strongman rule as being necessary in the Philippines. So on a symbolic level, it's Duterte that's giving Marcos the win. But also on a kind of brass tacks level, Sara Duterte is delivering Mindanao for Ferdinand Marcos Jr. Had she run against Ferdinand Marcos Jr., there's an argument to be made that she could have beaten him because he had Mindanao. Now, the strategy of the Marcoses has always been demographic. Ferdinand Marcos, for example, in 65 said, I take the north, Imelda takes the middle because he's from the north and Imelda is from Leyte. But actually, Leyte is actually not the south. The south is Mindanao. But Ferdinand Marcos Jr. was saying that was the south. Now they really have the south, right? Ferdinand Marcos takes care of the north, Imelda Marcos takes care of the middle, Sara Duterte takes care of the south.
I'm sorry, but I said I was going to shut up. I just read that the MILF Bangsamoro, just came out to support Lenny Robredo.
Yeah.
So the South is now divided.
Yeah, that's the fascinating thing because there are 43 private armies in the autonomous region of Mindanao alone. And the more Islamic Liberation Front's 14,000 armed troops are still intact. They haven't given up their arms. They've given up all the arms. That's how, and the question then is, one of the dreams of the MIF leadership is how to neutralize these 41 private armies, of which by politicians who are very much involved in the illicit sector, guns, narcotics, etc. But the previous president said no because we need this guy's support in Congress. So the interesting thing now is that there is no single political power in the Moro regions. And the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which is 14,000 army, and it's learning how to build a state now, has really now, is in a position to say, okay, we can do away with these private armies. I mean, they're a very fascinating group. They actually, I'm friends with them. They email me and tell me I'm wrong. Very well adept, very adept. The only thing that they really, they're taking seriously the fact that they're building a new state, and there is no place for warlord families in it, and that's why it's very interesting what happens if the Bongbong becomes president. The MILF's memory of the father destroying the towns in Cotabato. It's not the Maguindanao. The wars were in Jolo and Cotabato. They haven't forgotten that. And so what happens now, it's a very interesting opposition, as I told Liloy, because it had the business class, the private sector, the academia, and 2 armed groups, the Communist Party and the Moro Islamic Liberation. I've never seen an opposition group like this before. And in Mindanao, the Communist Party is strong. The Communist Party and the MIL are both based in Mindanao, and this is where the forces are strongest. So it's gonna be fun. No, interesting.
No, yeah, I think to answer that, I think it's definitely splitting now, and that's one of the things that maybe the last survey didn't get. But prior to that, at least, Ferdinand Marcos's support is strongest in Mindanao, which just shows. And it wasn't that, and the bump, because we can track this, the bump after the Sara Duterte endorsement was I think am I right? A 15% bump in Mindanao. It's huge. Like the Sara Duterte effect has been huge. And in a sense, I think Rodrigo Duterte is right to be pissed at the Marcoses because he wanted his daughter to run because he thought his daughter was a better candidate, and I think he's probably right. Right? There's Ferdinand Marcos Jr. has no charisma. There's this one, I mean, there's this one very interesting video where an old woman is asking them for hugs, and Bongbong goes in like this, like really gingerly, like because I want to hug, you don't want to touch the poor, right? And Sara Duterte just goes at it, right? Yeah.
That's a good point. No, just before the panel started, Liloy and I were talking about how some of the TikTok videos defending Marcos say things like, in Tagalog, tinatago niya ang galing niya, like he's hiding his talents. And so we're cracking up about this idea that how do you argue against that if that's what they are saying, that it is something and they're doing on purpose to hide how intelligent he is or how much of a good candidate he would be.
They hidden all his life because they're none.
But that also brings us back too to these broader issues of political communication and campaigning and how that's cast. I mean, one of the findings that are coming out of some of the literature in political communication that sort of gives us pause in thinking about the Philippines moving forward is that it seems like a lot of these new forms of communication, like TikTok and social media and Facebook, tend to benefit the type of messaging that is not programmatic or that messaging that's not about politics, right? If you only have 140 characters, there's not time to lay out a policy plan. And so the idea is that, what if we're moving towards an area where we're getting systematically this form of delivery of messages, which tends to prioritize and essentially give a leg up to candidates without a policy platform at the expense of the ones who would be normally giving speeches or participating in debates.
I think in terms of policy, it's always been thin,
Yes.
policy-wise. I mean, even Lenny, I like Lenny Robredo, but even her policy is thin. I mean, somebody wrote a piece on what her economic policy would look like, and it's like essentially fiscal expansion for social services, which is what every reformist candidate says, right? Very little about how you'll accumulate the money for that, right? Whereas in a sense, actually, Ferdinand Marcos, the one time I've heard him talk about policy is where he questioned the kind of aversion of Filipinos towards debt, which I thought was kind of interesting because, I mean, Filipinos always think that the country is in debt and that we'll be paying debt forever, when it's actually patently not true, right? Prior to the pandemic, the debt to GDP ratio was one of the lowest in the world. It was in the bottom third, right, at around 39%. That grew during the pandemic to around 55, 57%. But that still places you in the in the bottom half of the world, right? So, I mean, Filipinos just have to accept that modern economies run on credit and run on debt, right? In many ways, that's the only nice policy thing I heard from Ferdinand Marcos. Also, the other nice policy thing I heard there are two bits of decent policy that I heard from Ferdinand Marcos. One is that kind of more expansive idea of how debt works, and second one, possible abortions for victims of domestic abuse or domestic violence or rape. He was the only one who actually said that he was open to that possibility.
One nice thing is that Comelec has been partnering with many organizations in the Philippines to produce this type of voter education that would include policies and policy positions. So I think this includes for the first time the debates and the other activities. But then the problem becomes this sort of differential participation. Even on the website, for example, there were many of the documents and questions that candidates just didn't answer. And so there's these big gaps in the sort of policy positions that are available. Yes, please.
Yeah, so I just wanted to follow up on that. So if the policies are really thin, can you speak a little bit to like what is the appeal then that these politicians have to make then to attract the voters? Like what is it about them that makes people like them?
Sarah? Or
In general. So like, with Bongbong Marcos, with Lenny Robredo, like can you speak a little bit to that?
So
I was doing my graduate studies when Duterte was mayor, and Sarah also, in a way, speaks like that. I actually laughed at his jokes because he reminded me of my aunts when they're drunk. So Sarah is like that. I don't know Robredo. I mean, I look at things from the local level, so it really depends in each municipality. Like Duterte was really, he was killing people, but he was also one of the first mayors to support LGBT rights at the local level and provided state support for sex workers and no smoking. That was itself no smoking. So my sense is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that people get politicians appeal to people, or people get attracted to them based on what they can concretely get at the bottom. And so national, they're far. Mindanaoans would say, "Oh, that's Imperial Manila. We have no place for that." And so it's really, really very local. I mean, there's still the general policy.
So we can talk about. I think that question is best answered through specific politicians. I don't think there's a kind of general rule. Like for Duterte, I think Jojo explained part of the appeal. For Marcos, there have been studies on kind of his TikTok behavior, and in TikTok, I don't want to watch the TikToks, so I just read the studies. But what the studies say is that in these TikTok videos, he does not talk about politics at all. He does not mention the father. Imelda Marcos only makes one appearance, and that was for some anniversary or some birthday. And most of the time, it's just him and his son talking about the games they play, and then they surreptitiously show you how rich they are, because like even if it's just him and his son talking, like it's in a palatial house, and you see all the expensive things in the background. So there are subtle flexes, and so it's subtly aspirational, but it's anchored on the story of this father and son of three generations of Marcos men, all named Ferdinand Marcos, because Bongbong Marcos' son is Ferdinand Marcos as well, right? So apparently, and so that's where the conversation goes beyond fake news, because this is technically not fake news, right? It's a kind of fake artificial narrative, but it can't be flagged as fake news. And so to study this phenomenon goes beyond this kind of frame of disinformation/truth.
It's a great point. And more generally, too, one way to think about it is to think about all of the different elements of vote choice. So, for example, from some of the studies that we have done, we've looked at how much voters value things like the candidate characteristics, things like whether you think candidates are honest or whether you think candidates are capable. But what's interesting there is I think that how much you value things like honesty depend on what type of candidate you would like. So for most Filipinos, what they want is not necessarily an honest candidate, but one who is madaling lapitan or approachable, right? And with approachable, what they mean is, can you get this person to give you some money at election day, or can you get this person to pay for your medical expenses if you get sick? And so those types of traits is what we see people placing more emphasis on. But in addition to that idea of candidate valence and candidate characteristics, there's also what Professor Abinales was saying, this idea that local, the perception of local achievements and local abilities matters, because for most Filipinos outside of Manila, their first and only interaction with government is at their local level. So their mayors and their mayors' policies. And so those two things, like policies to them, are entirely local. Candidate characteristics matter a lot. But the third and the largest determinant of vote choice, at least at these local levels, very small levels, is vote buying. So that is the third piece of the puzzle there. And what we found is that even if you give voters information, you can get them to value policies more, but it still doesn't take away the importance of vote buying. So they would still place a lot of emphasis on it, even if they are now weighing policies and political considerations more.
There might be one policy that Filipinos would demand, which is do not prevent us from going abroad to work. And do not tax us. I mean, there was rumors that under President Ramos, he said, well, let's tax all these Filipinos abroad. And there was this furor. 4,000 Filipinos leave the country every day. Okay. So
That
that's what
started with Arroyo, actually.
Yeah, and there are others at Arroyo. Yeah.
It
What's the
started,
taxing?
they were studying it, and I know that because I was asked by the government
Oh,
if
really?
they could tax
Yeah.
overseas workers, and I
Oh,
said,
that was a
why
rebellion.
the heck will you do that?
Yeah.
That would be a very
So that
bad
would be
policy.
that would be the only policy I think that Filipinos would demand. No, don't let us. Don't let my kid. Don't prevent my kid from going to work in Saudi Arabia, or so.
Yes, please.
This is a follow-up on the question of electability. Specifically,
Sorry, again.
how do you think gender affects electability in candidates, if at all? Because especially like here in the United States, that was kind of a big question of how much that played with Hillary Clinton. But do you think that's playing at all with this current election and even with Arroyo and Aquino and their electability as well?
Most of us I've spoken to, both Pulse Asia and SWS, they say that there's already a built-in inherent disadvantage to any female candidate, like 5% de facto disadvantage. I forget the exact number, but it's already built in. And of course, on the level of narrative, right? I think we've entered a new dispensation in Philippine politics. So from '86 until roughly 2006, the key words in Philippine politics were really accountability, reform, and in a way democracy, right? But now the key words in Philippine politics are order, discipline, strength, right? Malakas. So this is almost like the shift from it's the equivalent shift in narrative from kind of the New Deal narrative in the United States to the Reaganite narrative. It's that big of a narrative shift. And of course, if you have a narrative shift that big, and the narrative is such that it privileges things that Filipinos associate with men, right? Strength, then it will systematically disadvantage women. I mean, you see this, for example, even in the Senate race. Who's leading the Senate? In another election, actually, people would be talking about the Senate because the person leading the senatorial race is something I've been writing, someone I've been telling people to watch out for 10 years. His name is Rafi Tulfo, and he's now leading the Senate race, and he's the kind of closest thing you really get to a Duterte figure because he was a media guy whose reputation is I'm strong. You call him if you have a problem with your mayor, and what he'll do is he'll call your mayor, cuss your mayor out, and make sure that your mayor is accountable to him. So he's that kind of person, right? And Filipinos like that kind of masculinity. So it's an inherent disadvantage.
I go from the opposite side. This is a country where 3 women presidents. More women actually at the congressional and congressional level. I mean, it's a very fascinating topic that you raised because, like, I study Mindanao. Muslim clans fight each other. They have this called Tingarido where they fight across generations. And the only way that you can resolve it is for the wives. It's the wives that moderate it, and then they agree. So in 2008, when the Mindanao massacre happened, it broke the norm because the other guy, the Abatuans killed the wife. And the story was, then the Mangunta said, well, in exchange for that, you have to kill your 3 sons. So I think women, I mean, what would Philippine political history look like if you looked at it from the perspective of women? Imelda Marcos, Cory Aquino, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo. She's scary. I mean, quintessential Machiavellian, fluent in 8 Philippine languages, scolds her husband in Spanish, speaks French. I mean, Lilo and I will disagree on this, but I think if Marcos wins, this is the 3rd term of Gloria Arroyo. I mean, so I don't know. I mean, you're a historian. If you want to study the role of gender in the Philippines, it's a complicated, fascinating process actually, because most of them, at least for Muslims, for example, the Muslim women hide at the back because my husband is an idiot, he only knows how to play gun, but he likes the media. But I run the city, I run the family business, etc. And it's a difficult research topic because they don't want you to know them. Because once you know them, then you will know who the real power is. But it's also an interesting, I think only a woman can do the research. Maybe I can get you
I'm actually writing a senior thesis here at UCLA.
I mean, Duterte's mother had an office behind his office when he was mayor. So you do not go to talk to Digong and say, can I interview you, sir? You have to go to Nanay Soling, Soledad. Because Soledad is the one who controlled everything.
Yeah.
But isn't that because the Philippines culturally is really a matriarchal society?
Yeah, but it
And-
echoes in different ways. Yeah.
As a woman who grew up in the Philippines, I remember, studying in an all-girls school where our sentiment was really, we were being trained, to be wives of
Yeah.
important men so that we could control
Right.
what they do. So growing up, that was basically instilled in us that, no, you manipulate men.
Yeah.
Because you're the one that makes the decision for them to follow through.
It's
I mean, I'm saying it.
yeah.
I'm saying it basically. Just are cutting through the.
It cuts across political divide.
Yeah. But
Sis-
that's the whole Philippines.
right. Sister Christine Tan, for example, the human rights lawyer in the 70s, the Pope called her, sent to Rome to tell her to stop complaining and protesting against Marcos and act like a nun. Of course, she ignored him. But so this kind of, it's a really interesting topic to explore, which is what would Philippine politics and history look like if you view it from the perspective of gender.
it's gonna play out again in the Marcos II presidency.
Yeah,
Because the
well,
person you
the
really need
wife.
to talk about is the wife, Lisa
Yes.
Araneta. And a lot of people in Manila believe that she is going to be the next power. I mean, Bongbong Marcos is a party animal, right? He just wants to have a good time. And he likes the privileges. He likes the privileges of being in Malacanang. But he's really not interested in governance because this is someone who grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth and just wants to go back to the good old days where daddy did everything for him. Right?
Yeah.
But the wife, you can tell, based on her media appearances and also based on gossip, that she's going to be the power. And she has connections everywhere. Like her law firm, for example, she was a partner in the law firm, and one of the other partners in the law firm was the chief of staff of Benigno Aquino, who is supposedly the rival of the Marcoses, right?
Yeah.
So she even has an in with the kind of yellow camp, the yellow opposition, and she comes from the Araneta family, and the Araneta family is also associated with the opposition. So she can she has connections everywhere. And it's because she actually comes if you think about it in terms of the long durée of Philippine history, the Marcoses are a Parvenu family.
Yeah.
They're a Parvenu family. The Araneta's are a real political clan that has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years.
That's actually a great point. So I'm going to assert moderator privilege here, also as the only woman on the panel. And say that actually I have something that's sort of in between these two perspectives about what the power of women is. So I think there, on one hand, yes, I think if you look at just numbers, the number of women that are sitting in the seats, holding office, we look almost like developed countries. Like we're certainly at the top of the region. But I think this is a mixed story. On one hand, yes, we look like developed countries, but on the other hand, we're getting that effect almost entirely because of dynasties, right? So even our female heads of state, it's like daughter of a much beloved president, widow of a much loved opposition leader. So on one hand, it's like, is it really girl power if it's coming through these types of mechanisms? And even with Bongbong's wife, right? She's part of a political family, and that's what elevates her and gives her that kind of status. But on the other hand, I think maybe there's somewhere in the middle. Like my view of it is that it is still a sign of some sort of progress. It's maybe it's not like Sweden or something like that. But I just remember one mayor that I was interviewing saying to me, he said, the fact that he could choose his smart and capable daughter over his idiot son as a successor. He said that was a sign of progress. And in fact, he told me that such a thing would never happen in his father's day because otherwise it would be his sister that I would be talking to.
Were you interviewing Rodrigo Duterte? Because that's how he thinks about things.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's this idea where you're expanding selection, even if it's limited to these political families. At least now you're expanding them to also women in these new generations. But I think there's a broader, more systemic problem of that gap in recognition because women tend to be behind the scenes. That, for example, some of the work that we coming out of my research team, we're looking at how how women and men are differentially rewarded. So if men run for office, they're perceived to be very politically influential, but such an effect doesn't happen for women, right? So the types of activities that normally are associated with influence, like running for office, voting, attending meetings, they lead to influence just for men. But for women, the pathway is really, really difficult. You have to be everything, basically. You have to be involved in your community, you have to do all those things. So the idea that there's this barrier that's more about social and cultural norms rather than legal and sort of political ones.
And of course,
But yes, exactly. Thank you
Yeah,
for
that's
letting
great.
me.
Yeah,
thank
that's
you for letting me do a little aside
Thank
on.
you.
No, it's really important. That's,
gender.
that's really important.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, what you pointed out is really important because, the mothers would always say, politician mothers say, yeah, my son's smart. My husband is really an idiot, He's not really an idiot. I mean, talking to all these Muslim rebels, yeah, I take care of everything without me raising funds. Those guys in the mountains could never survive. And then you say, can you tell your story? No. Because my daughter's gonna control her husband. We have this power, this social capital that we're not gonna reveal to you. And let my husband face the media, but at the end of the day, we control it. And so those were just a fascinating episode. We were interviewing Moro National Liberation Front officials who became officials of the Autonomous Region for Muslim Mindanao. And they were all bragging about their new computers from the Australians. And I was part of the Japanese delegation, and they were saying, and the guy's like, "Well, look at this. We have this computer from Australia." And then he shifted to Mindanao, which can understand a bit. Said, "How do you turn this on?" And so the secretary just come in and then leave. And it's sort of like, whoa, where are we going with this? Islam, Philippine Islam? No, the women are in power here. So I think you're right there, and it has a different way of. If you want to study that, its relationship between men and women politically, you have to really explore cultural, social, even historical, factors, and in order to figure out how powerful they are. I mean, Mrs. Marcos, no? Mrs. Marcos used Adobe Beam tape to destroy her husband. Anyway, yeah, I think Ceci,
But the other thing is, if I could put in a plug, I will be hiring for all these projects on gender in the Philippines starting this summer.
There you go.
Please,
There you go.
if you want to work on the topic,
There you go.
I would really appreciate the extra help.
Just the grant.
I'm really abusing the moderator
Yeah, it's just a
for
grant.
privileges here now, I think. So, moving on from gender and girl power and me trying to hire some researchers out of this panel, can we go back to just the very first things that you were talking about in your opening statements? Like, if you could somehow go back to 1986, like what do you think the thing that you would do differently is? I feel like I'm gonna let Professor Claudio go first because I think Professor Abinales is gonna.
I think I know what he wants to say, but Ceausescu.
Oh.
Huh? Ceausescu. We joke about it all the time. I mean, when the Ceausescus in Romania, right, fell, they were dragged across the street and shot.
Oh.
And sometimes we forget that was actually an option. I'm not saying that it should have happened. But one wonders, right, in 86, I'm not saying
He's speaking very academically, everyone.
I'm not saying this is what should have happened. I am not for extrajudicial killings. But there is another way 86 could have turned out because the people were already massing up outside Malacanang Palace. Everybody's talking about what happened on EDSA. But actually, parallel to that, people were already getting ready to storm the palace and actually just tear through it and probably drag the Marcoses across the street, kind of like what happened in Libya and kind of like what happened in Romania with the Ceausescus, right? So that's not the kind of model of justice I envision, but there has to have been something in between that, the storming of Malacanang Palace and the murder of the dictator, and letting them go to Hawaii and then come back and restore their name almost immediately, right? 91 they come back, right? So what's the middle ground between those two things? I'm not entirely sure, but surely there's a middle ground there.
The problem with 86 really was it was a failed coup, and when Mrs. Aquino came to power, it's very fragile. Okay, we actually volunteered for the first thing after Malacanang, left over Malacanang, and it was bedlam. The secretary, Joker Arroyo, President Aquino's chief of staff, was running the government from the back of his car. Yeah. So it was a regime that was the product of accidents, okay, products of mistakes. It was, people glorify EDSA as the special process of peaceful transfer of power. No? It's a bunch of mistakes. It was really comical in a certain way. I'll tell you this comic stories later. So with Liloy, I agree with that. You should have shot him. Shot them.
I didn't say that.
Sorry, Filipinos.
I know.
But I would
if Liloy gets hate mail after this, and then,
I'll pass it on to him.
Didn't say
But
that.
that was, there was a move to expropriate them with the wealth because everybody knew where they were, and I think everybody criticizes Cory Aquino for this, but really left her no choice. The only way she could consolidate power, for example, was to make compromises with local politicians. Okay. Because EDSA was really a Manila event, no? And the idea was supposed to be, if the Communist Party supported Aquino, okay, and that's 1 million strong, okay, if she then won power, this is the dream of her, human rights lawyer, having beers with them. If she won power, then the party supported her, the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the NPA would negotiate peace. The members of the legal organizations of the party should join government because nobody knew how to run the state. Her left wing, her left side, were all, there were academics from Ateneo. And they were urban terrorists. They never knew how to, they were businessmen, but they never knew how to run government. The left, by 1985, had 1 million strong, 1 million strong mass base, 30,000 cadres. The cadres I interviewed in Mindanao were fantastic. They know how to invest in Hong Kong. Anyway, so the idea was that, but then the left, boycotted, and that therefore paralyzed it. The idea was that left them counterbalance the politicians that she had to win over from the different cities, from different towns. And here, Secretary of Local Government, Pimentel, had to make those compromises at the bottom so that they would support her. So that by 87, the kind of Congress that was set up, how many was it? Of the 200 members of the House of Representatives, 130 of them already belong to traditional political families. So 67 of them were pro-Marcos families. So that's why I agree with we should have a cut of their heads, chop off their heads, expropriate everything. Because there was already it was easy in UP when Mrs. Aquino called for a boycott of Marcos cronies food. The School of Business Administration, they're a political faculty members. We're already planning how to take over Coca-Cola, which was a crony. If we were to take over, if Marcos fell, this is our plan. But she was hemmed in from all sides. Gringo was trying to overthrow her. She had to set a cabinet which included Juan Ponce, traditional politicians. And therefore, she didn't know how to run a regime, though. We eventually quit the office of the president's office because what Mrs. Aquino asked, for example, is that if you want to write something policy, 5 sentences. Because Cory will have to, just cover everything. So how do you write a policy on the removal of the U.S. bases in 5 sentences? So okay. So, yes, if for 86 were to happen again, they should have bombed the hell out of this, Malacanang Palace.
just so people are not sending angry emails to the
That's
chancellor,
okay.
to the chancellor at
But
UC Berkeley, I would like to give Professor Claudio another opportunity to reiterate that he indeed was
I do
asking
not.
for a middle ground solution so that we don't get him in trouble.
Yeah, I do not advocate for executions.
I get death threats, so I'm okay with it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not worried about Professor Abinales because he's used to the hate mail. But I didn't want those nice chancellor at Berkeley to be getting hate
I have
mail on
tenure.
behalf of Claudio. But I think the other way to approach this, right, is thinking about what might happen in terms of government and politics at that time, but also from the standpoint of us in our day jobs. We're academics, all of us, right? Like this is a time when political science, my discipline, was not a very well established discipline in the country. You talked a little bit about history was sort of hollowed out and lost a generation of scholarship. But if you could go back to the academics of that time period, like what would you like to see in terms of coming out and talking about teaching about it?
Yeah, I have one example. This was very hard for academics at that time, anti-Marcos, because they were so angry. But a sense of proportion, I think, would have helped out because the pro-Marcos camp likes to portray anti-Marcos as hysterical and unreasonable, right? And at that time, because of the trauma, most of the anti-Marcos historians could not grant Marcos anything. Like, he was just evil incarnate. And I think the first anti-Marcos historian who wrote in a mainstream textbook that Marcos had done decent work in terms of infrastructure production was their textbook, State and Society in the Philippines, which actually covers the first term in a fair manner. Um, Another example, for instance, is the 1980 debt crisis. So the 1980 debt crisis, the way anti-Marcos historians have written about the 1980 debt crisis is that Marcos accumulated a lot of debt and he buried all of the Filipinos for generations to come in debt. Never mind the fact that the rest of the world was undergoing a debt crisis in the 1980s as well. In Latin America, of course, that's called La Decada Perdida. And it's not all some of it was Marcos's fault. Yes, he did accumulate more debt than Mexico and Indonesia. But all third world countries were indebted at that time, and all third world countries went into a debt crisis because in the United States, Paul Volcker raised the interest rates in 1980, and yet the way anti-Marcos historians talk about it, and the way I used to talk about it was Marcos buried us in debt. We're paying that debt until today, right? And then the Marcos camp comes back and says, wait a minute, there's a lot more to it than that. And so I think at this point, what we need to do is kind of have a sense of perspective. And if you have a sense of perspective, and if you're not so sure of yourself, as we've been and if you evince a certain level of doubt, then I think people are more likely to listen to you. Certainty is going to be the enemy of accuracy in the future.
Before I accidentally ended up in grad school, I was a staff at the University of Philippines Third Study Center. We were a small group. We only had 500 pesos a year budget for maintenance and equipment. But by 1980, we were receiving money from UN and doing this extensive political economy studies of Mindanao, the banana plantations. We were also extending studies in military. By 85 actually, there was a group of us, new degrees actually, who were studying what would happen if Marcos fell. So the other group that was doing that was the political section of the U.S. Embassy. But the problem was after Marcos fell, like the Thais and the Indonesians, we had to go to grad school. So a lot of my generation, because you can't write, the university, the third world studies could not support us with our books. We had to, we have to become faculty, for example. Or we didn't want to become faculty. We hated faculty politics. But then we realized also that to be respected at that time was you have to have credentials. So where do you get the credentials? You go to grad school. So like me, I accidentally ended up in grad school. And the same with the Thais, my Thai friends who were veterans of the 73 democratization movement and the 76 repression movement, like Kung Chai Win Chakun, who wrote Sayamat. They, after the military instituted amnesty, they all went to grad school. So that's also one thing that you have to consider. But at the third world studies, we were really doing research already on Japan and the impact of the banana and pineapple industry in Mindanao, the war in Mindanao, the military. So there were all these sub-study groups that were doing. But we were such a small institution, nobody cared for us until, I guess, the 80s. But the studies were all there. But it was all mimeograph. Yeah, yeah, it was mimeograph. And so it had limited impact on even the academia. But yeah, those are the realities.
I feel like I'm gonna need a moment after hearing you talk about accidentally ending up in grad school when your book was the reason that I wanted to be a political scientist.
Okay, oh my God!
Although maybe now you are regretting it and having to be on a panel with me, but it was the reason why I started grad school. So it was not an accident in my case. It was receiving a copy and reading a copy of your book that made me decide between political science and economics.
Oh,
so.
I'm sorry. I'll tell you later why I ended up grad school.
So no, this has been really helpful. I think like part of why I wanted to ask about what you would do if we could go back to 1986 is because it speaks to what you think we should all be doing right at this moment. Like what is it that we are called to do as academics, as voters, as people with our own spheres of influence or various activities and roles that we can play in this election. What are the future Professor Abinales and future Professor Claudio going to want from us in this moment?
This I have a historian friend in my Facebook, and he is teaching post-war Philippine. And his students actually said, "Can we dispense that and can we talk about martial law? Can you tell us about martial law?" That's a 17, 18-year-old. It's really interesting. In Hawaii, what I do is, where are you from? And they would say, "I'm from Ilocos." Or I said, "Do you know the warlord there?" Like, what? Yes, this is the story of the warlord, that guy who, over there. And they would go home and ask their parents, say, "Is it really true that, we come from a warlord family?" And some of them go, yeah. So what I've done so far is your generation had parents who were either in the movement or supported Marcos and all that. So what I do with my students is go home and interview your parents and ask them. And a couple of them said, "Well, my parents said he was a guerrilla. She was a guerrilla." Like, "Oh, tell her more." Yeah. And then the parents actually start talking about it because in the past they would hide it. I mean, this practical. That's practical. Room-based. I mean, Hawaii is all Ilocanos. And all of them came from 2-3 provinces. And a lot of them are Marcos loyalists, but there's also a couple of kids who say, my father was in Mindanao, a soldier in Mindanao, and when he came back, he was traumatized in 75. So I think there is a change now. Young generation in the Philippines actually saying, "What the heck is martial law? Tell us about it." So Jelly Kalang said, "Yeah, we're gonna set the rest of the semester. We're gonna talk about martial law." That's 15 years, and in my case, it's just telling students, "Come on, it's your father." And I think as educators, that's I think where we should go, because one thing that we completely forget is that these are our personal experiences. Yeah, I mean, one reason I ended up in grad school because both of my best friends were assassinated by the military in '87 after martial law. Marcos came to power, and then Mrs. Aquino, my best friend Leon Alejandro, was killed, and then another friend of mine was killed. So that sort of thing, you can't write about it. In the Philippines, I had to go to grad school to write about it, and then come up with a different story, of course. So yeah, the other one was my girlfriend, but then not important. So yeah, I think as educators, as teachers, and students like you guys, ask questions. Demand from your teachers that we need to study this. We can study the pre-colonial Philippines. Well, the pre-colonial Philippines is interesting. But yeah, and we've been doing this. Zoom actually is a great thing. I mean, we're doing a Zoom discussion with kids from Philippine Polytechnic University of the Philippines. I did mention you that they'd contact you to talk about surveys and how to, and Zoom actually is a great way in which Filipino Americans can connect with their generation mates back home and tell stories. Because in a certain way, your fathers and grandfathers and grandmothers and mothers we're the ones who are exposed. We're my generation. We're the ones exposed to martial law, and that's a story that has yet to be told completely. It's a fun story. It's sad. Sorry. Yes.
I love this idea of asking people to tell their stories and demanding that we hear the stories. Professor Claudio? I'm sure you're on board with all of this. With
Her mother, his mother, his mother, his father.
Yeah,
Martial law activist.
I don't know what to add to that. Yeah, just tell the stories and tell them with a sense of proportion, and then of course just reach out. I think at this point the Philippines is there's very little polarization in the Philippines during the Duterte period, but I have a sense, given what's happened in this election, there's going to be significant polarization. And the axis for polarization is going to be Marcos and the history of martial law. So this is where people have to reach out and really connect to that other side. I don't know how that's done, but definitely it's not going to happen through social media. It's not going to happen through social media. I think Filipinos should just log out, and if they can, delete Facebook.
No, that's a good point. I actually want I want to bring back one of your earlier points about how we've done a good job in terms of educating the sort of elite middle class and for them to be sort of speaking to each other and engaging with each other. But what do you see as the bridge to, what can those people who are part of that elite middle class, what can they do to do better, and what can they do to reach out other than deleting Facebook?
Yeah, I think the Robredo campaign has done a good job because it's emphasized house-to-house efforts as a kind of electoral strategy. But how can we think about that as something that's beyond an electoral strategy? The challenge for the opposition is how it's going to move from an electoral campaign to a broad anti-dictatorship coalition. And it can use a lot of the strategies of the electoral campaign in that regard, like the house-to-house, for example, the kind of positive messaging. Pink was a wonderful celebratory color, and it's so different from. It's just a few shades shy of red, but in terms of joy, it's so different, right? And in terms of its relationship with masculinity, it's so different as well. And so I think we have an opportunity here to create, for the first time, an opposition to dictatorship that is not as grim and determined as the kind of opposition that was created during Jojo's time, right? This can be an opposition of Iran.
Yes, that's a great point. I think one thing that sometimes is underestimated in the polls and the news is this building up of this door to door, this very grassroots type of campaign. I think one issue of concern though is that these types of interventions, these door to door talking to voters, can be very effective in encouraging people to become more excited and more engaged at the moment. But what we found is, for example, these effects can be very short term, or they don't necessarily help voters learn or learn how to make decisions better. So it's sort of, we can make people excited and engaged, but how do we go from that stage of excitement and engagement to building these sort of long-term coalitions that Professor Claudio is referring to as what we need to have moving forward?
Well, for the Center of Southeast Asian Studies, you have to teach more Filipino languages. Because my argument is local. Why is Duterte popular? Because Davao Tagalog is now the de facto national language. His Cebuano is not my cousin Cebuano in Davao. His Cebuano is my Cebuano. That's why when my auntie and my mother curse, it reminds, they talk the same way. And what's interesting about the Philippines now, partly because of this global diaspora we have, we are the most polyglot country in the world. I used to flight from Manila to Bangkok, I used to sit with Filipinas. And I said, where are you going? Saudi Arabia. They said, you speak fluent Arabic. I said, close your eyes. Fluent Arabic. There's a wonderful documentary called Paper Dolls. It's about these 4 transvestites in Jerusalem taking care of retired Hebrew Jewish families, including traditional Jews. And my Israeli student said, I said, what do you think of their Hebrew? And he said, if I close my eyes, it's Jerusalem Hebrew. If you line up in the airport today, in my college days, it's all these young kids with their California accent. Mommy, what the heck? You know? But if you line up in the airport today, you have a kid speaking in French to her parents, Chinese or Japanese to their parents. I mean, German, French, like the fascinating transformation of Filipinos abroad. In Japan, 10 years in Kyoto, the Filipinos there speak male Japanese. It's really fun because they curse and like that. No? And so that one also, but the other side is because of this free movement of people, people pick up languages very fast. I mean, my favorite example are the smugglers in Holo. They speak 8 languages. So, Maguindanao, Maranao, Tausug, Tagalog, Visayan, English,
Indonesian.
Bahasa Malaysia, Bahasa Indonesia, and Hokkien. Chinese because... So, I think what's happening is that in Imperial Manila, they still teach you Tagalog and speak in English. But, you know, once you go out, people will speak in English, but they'll also shift to their local languages. And the problem with the opposition is, go on TV, they speak English. That cannot be anymore. The other side of it is Tagalog, because of the nationalization of TV, is now the de facto language too, but it's Davao Tagalog. Like even the Muslim, the terrorists, the Islamic terrorists, the Abu Sayyaf, when they interview, they speak in Tagalog, not Tausug anymore. What the heck? Commander Robot speaking in Tagalog. And so there's that possibility, but I think it's also the fact that even as it nationalized, these local languages persist. Continue. I mean, I don't want Liloy to understand, I shift to Bisayan. And Boboy the same thing. If you don't want to understand, I shift to Bicolano, which I could never understand.
Kabaluan mo sa plan.
So that sort, I think, is very important. And to go back to our role as educators, is to encourage kids to speak their parents' language. My daughter's actually learning. Can you teach me Bisayan, Dad? Sure. But what kind of Bisayan? You know, Duterte Bisayan or your mother's Bisayan, your grandmother's Bisayan. So that sort of thing is actually something we have to consider if the opposition were to be an effective opposition. Marcos shifted, Bongbong doesn't, but I mean Marcos speaks fluent Ilocano. You know, so yeah, that's just my take on being from the province. Sorry.
Bongbong doesn't speak.
No, that's
Maray.
no,
He's
Ilocano.
not a polyglot.
He's not polyglot. The polyglot, I think, is Aini. But it's fascinating actually to watch what the diaspora has done to Philippines. To listen to a Filipino mother talk in Arabic. Wow! Yeah, so German, French. That might be the way to reach out.
I think it certainly starts with being able to talk to each other and being able to communicate for sure.
Yeah.
So just as we're coming to a close here in our panel, I want to ask you if there's anything that makes you feel optimistic about Philippine politics. I think sometime among political scientists, I think a lot of us are, we're hoping that this won't be the last election that we get to study or take surveys about. But I wanted to know whether there's something in your work or something that you're seeing that gives you hope or optimism about what the direction that the country can take in the future, even if it's a very long future.
Go ahead.
I'll take a cynical side. The interesting thing about warlord families, political families, is it's like the movie Godfather. Yeah? They want their kids to become educated, go to Harvard and all that. So all these warlord families, for example, in Mindanao, they send their kids to the University of Philippines College of Law to study. One of the warlords in Lanao del Sur, actually, Ali de Maporo, one of the most powerful, the birds and the bees will vote for Marcos. There's municipalities in Lanao del Sur where there are more voters than voting. There are more votes than voters. Ali actually sent his grandson to the University of San Francisco. So he came back, and Ali de Maporo went back to take over the mom's position as governor. He could speak NGO talk. He'd say, the stakeholders, This is not the father, not the grandfather. The grandfather would just shoot him and all that. So he's talking about stakeholders and what was the other term that he used to distribute him? Well, to reach out to civil society. I'm like, where did you learn this, kid? And apparently, in a certain way, the Michael Corleone feature creates that. Sarah Duterte is actually like that. One of the everybody focus on Bongbong, but my friends in Davao, and activist friends in Davao, are having this mixed feeling vis-a-vis Sarah because her chief of staff used to be the head of the National Women's Commission under President Aquino. There's all these feminists running around Sarah, and how do you? And they're all former activists, former guerrillas, and all that. So how do you deal with this? So in a certain way, part of the hope would come from the children, the grandchildren. I mean, here's a story from my end. I grew up in Osama City. The mayor was killed in 2017, I think. No? He was head of the Coratong Balileng, one of these. He used to run the heroin trade between Hong Kong and the Philippines in my hometown for 30 years. He was a very funny guy because my mother was the only one who could shout at him. He was scared. It was a scary, our Lord Mayor, and my mother could shout at him because he was my mother's high school student. And this is the funny thing about it is that in a very weird way, there may be, warlords, politicians, patrimonial elites. But once in a while, there's something that, my favorite story with him is that every time I go home, when I was still in Manila, he would call me and I'd say, hey, come on, let's talk about things. And one of the things, before he was killed, I think, in a wake, when my mother's wake, he said, well, you know what? The national government is giving us money. The mangroves in the bay are being destroyed by this global warming. And I said, how do I do this? I said, that's 0.5 of your heroin trade. 0.5, sir. Maybe you can allot some of that for the mangroves. Last time I visited the area before, the mangroves are actually thriving. And he was like, no money from USA, the Philippine government. Okay, I'll set aside some of my percentage. So there is, it's like Gollum and the Lord of the Rings. There's something salvageable in a lot of these evil people. And it's on that you really play. I mean, this guy was like, what do we do with the mangroves? Global crisis, like, marijuana, heroin. Yeah. And that involves a lot of conversations with them. The new generation of this actually fascinating generation, your generation, Muslim League activists that are coming out. Yes, Mira, and the way their dilemma is, how do you push for Islamic feminism that will not let you also be, tarred as a feminist? And they're fighting. Their arena for fighting is very narrow. No, Dad and Mom said, put your hijab on. Don't question. I'm gonna marry you off to that guy, and they probably will have political careers as village chiefs. And so their dilemma then is, how do you push forward the woman question in your village, in your hometown? And Yasmira is actually into that now. She's very funny. I mean, and so that kind of conversation is your place, your role. I mean, I know nothing about women politics, but you start sort of like, what? How about if you think like this? So these are the these are the obstacles you weigh, grandpa, papa. Where do you get your allies? Where do you get your classmates, cousins? And so it's a creative way in which what is good in the country, you have to tap creative way of pushing what is good amidst the sea of evil. So yeah, that's I think a rough way of optimistic. I mean, I'm really optimistic.
I think I say something similar, which is that the places where you can be optimistic are in these like pockets of good local governance that you see across the Philippines.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that the Duterte administration proved, is that you can take a local governance concept and make an argument that you should nationalize it. Of course, the good local governance concept of Duterte was mass murder, but you can use that kind of argument for other people. So, for example, now I'm most excited about the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region. There is a state building effort that's occurring in the south, and a lot of young people from Manila and from abroad are going home to build this new state to ensure that in 2025, once they have a parliament there, that it's going to be governed well. And so that's one example
Yeah.
of possible good governance that we can then scale up, right?
Yeah.
There are, of course, great mayors everywhere. I mean, there's this charismatic mayor in Pasig City, Vico Soto, that could be, the new voice for democratization. So I think the goal is to look for these people, these young people, and to turn these into kind of nodes of a potential democratic opposition, or just as an argument for what democracy looks like.
Yeah, just the more Islamic liberation front. They signed a peace agreement with the Philippine government, and the Philippine government said, "Yeah, okay, we'll set up the autonomous region for Muslim Mindanao." These are all guerrillas. They don't know how to, don't know how to run states. So my other feminist friend, Professor Guillaume, said, the first thing that we had to do are two things: teach them how to type and folders, and to tell them that their women cannot iron their clothes in these conferences because they're smarter than you. And that was the first thing. That's as boring as typing, as filing, to saying, well, my wife is here, can you clean up? No, that's over, man. So, and now they're thinking about parliament. There's guys are now thinking of an alternative form of government within the country that's based on political parties.
Yeah.
And this was 4 or 5 years ago. And one of the funny things is that, it's like, what the heck is Islamic governance? So they always say, let's send you to Malaysia. Let's send you. And the Japanese gave money to send to Malaysia, Turkey,
Hiroshima.
to learn how to run a state. So in 4 years, they started from typing and my wife ironing my clothes to now debating the kinds of political parties.
But that's also because young people are joining them.
Yeah, that's
Or
right. That's
not
Mira.
guerrillas,
Yeah, that's Mira. So, I mean, it's fun actually to do it. It's fun because as brass tacks as, sir, no. um, the other thing, for example, is the other I was studying is how a lot of these rebel returnees run businesses. And this is my other research, which is the question why the USAID is successful in more Mindanao. And to convert, one of the things that really tapped was Islamic families in the Philippines are religious, but these are communities also which were part of maritime Southeast Asia. They were traders. They trade. And therefore, the best approach for that is to say, okay, we'll tap that advantage of yours. Do not ask for money. We'll give you skills. And again, the women play a big role in here because they ran the business of their husbands. And one of the things they taught them was, finding a way to marry the illicit and the licit. Okay, these are communities where smuggling is the main activity. Okay, where the money is coming from smuggling. If you are USAID, how do you promote education? And one of the things they would say is that we don't care where where your counterpart money comes from, but we will give you this, and we'll set up a bunch of computers in this elementary school in this island in Pulo. And it ran like that. I mean, suddenly they worried about counting because it's the kids, Okay, how about setting apart some of your money, smuggling money to educate your kids, and that actually has helped a lot. I was witnessing this. Like, there are 20 computers in this island in the middle of nowhere, and it's running because the Filipino guy from USA said, here's a counterpart, computers, Microsoft, where's your money as PTA? And so that sort of everyday types of pushing back, reorienting, re-educating, convincing people is, I think, what makes politics in the country hopeful. I mean, I'm 66, but I'm still hopeful that we can do something. Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry. I to the MILF thing.
No, that was my answer.
They're fun.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think especially when we think about parties and for me, my what gives me hope is seeing voters responding to information, and we're seeing at a very small scale. We do all of our work is done very locally, but seeing that voters know everything that's happening in their municipalities, they can hold their politicians accountable.
Yeah.
And so thinking about how can we scale those efforts up to the national level and get voters thinking about policies that they want and the type of candidates and leaders that they want. So hopefully this will even our partners like Comelec and some of the organizations, hopefully they'll continue to provide this type of information and these different initiatives. So I want to give you two the last words here, and maybe and Boboy, would you like to say some last words as well?
He's an activist too.
But another part of my story.
Yeah, you should tell your story.
Well, thank you. It's fascinating. As someone who grew up in a household that's a Marcos supporter, my grandmother was a big Marcos supporter. But when I went to college, of course, my story is different. I've been saying the past week I've been having difficulties sleeping because of the idea of going to the Philippines every summer with my students and working, actively working with the national government, and then rethinking the idea of going back to the Philippines and working with the Marcos administration. When in college, although it wasn't Marcos, I was fighting against the same structures. But with the Robredo movement, I've seen kids, I call them kids now, who were apolitical, but are actively going into house-to-house campaigns. I think that's, even if Robredo loses, hopefully not, there is this movement from the future that might change the course of the history. So with an active opposition.
And you're involved in it.
Yes. So, but thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
I'm good. Thank you.
One last hope, one last story of optimism. In 1975, a classmate who joined the NPA. In 1977, my cousin, who was a lieutenant, family gathering in December, said, "Hey, I just arrested someone in the village," and they said, so what happened? Well, I caught her, and I knew she was a guerrilla because I asked the peasants to do this. She was the only one with no callus. So Tina. And I said, "What happened?" Well, we started interrogating her. My sergeant played the bad cop, beat her up, and then I played the good cop. And I sat down and I said, "Hey, you're from the University of the Philippines." And she said, "Yes." "I have a cousin there, Dom Jojo Abinales. What do you think?" Like, "He was my classmate!" And then from that time on, my cousin started reading all this stuff that she was producing. I was like, "Hey, you have a point there." He actually also didn't show up in her court case. That's why Tina has a story in YouTube about this. But what's interesting is that as he read, he became politicized and became part of the RAM group that tried to overthrow Marcos in '86. So this kind of conversation you have with your class enemy, as it were, could also change things. So they remain friends up to now. Colonel San Diego and Tina Pargas. Ito sister. Yeah, ito sister. So, the small things happen.
Any last remarks, Professor?
So that's optimistic.
Yeah, the commission, the late Commissioner of Human Rights, Chito Gascon, told me when Duterte was in power, things will get worse before they get better. So they just looks like they're gonna get worse, but the signs of them getting better are also there.
That's great. And if I can abuse moderator privilege one last time to encourage everybody to please go out and vote, and please make yourself be an informed voter. Demand more from your politicians. Think carefully about what types of things and what types of characteristics and policies that are important to you when you're making your choices, and encourage everybody around you to do the same. So I feel like I'm doing this on behalf of all the political scientists. Please go and vote. So thank you to our wonderful panelists for this very interesting discussion.
Thank you.
Professor Abinales and Professor Claudio, and of course to Boboy, thank you for inviting me to be a part of it as well. I think we are.
Oh, so there's
Yep,
like
thank you to all of you. Yep.
Yeah, great.
Maraming salamat.
Fun,